Welcome to the Jake Porter and Friends podcast. I'm joined here by a special guest in our first live podcast that we've done with Tyler Harris. Tyler is the former executive director of the Libertarian Party from 2020 to 2020. 2020 to 2022. Correct?
That's
And
correct.
you founded Open Flank Strategies, where you do consultancy work for campaigns. You're the chair of Project Liberal Action and the new executive director of the Project Liberal Foundation, doing great work over there. Wanted to bring you, and you're also a podcast author, and that's why we brought you on here today. What is your podcast, and what's your URL for it?
So I assume you're asking about my Substack. My
Or your
Substack,
Substack? I'm sorry.
you can find my Substack. It's called Desultory Scribblings, but I don't expect you to be able to spell that out there in podcast land. So you can just find it with my name, Tyler John Harris. .substack, all the stuff.
Well, I brought you on to discuss your recent article, "The Moral Cowardice of the Heart of Libertarianism," and it's something that's been weighing on me for actually quite a few years. Where I've thought this, the moral equivalency argument,
hmm
and I'll get kind of your thoughts on that in your summary, and I'll give you some of mine as well. So, what made you write this article?
Yeah, so I mean, this is part of a process that I began, I don't know, maybe 6-7 months ago of uh, doing the emotional and intellectual work of starting to deconstruct my own libertarianism. And I use the word deconstruct knowing deliberately that it's evocative of a lot of religious deconstruction and processes that people go through coming out of high demand religion and these sort of high demand sects of Christianity, which is not something I've personally done in my life coming out of those spaces. But it feels like there are appropriate parallels coming out of capital L libertarianism and maybe even lowercase l libertarianism. And it seems like a decent opportunity to step back and reflect and unpack and sort of disassemble a lot of the assumptions and axioms that I very routinely embraced for years within the Libertarian Party, just sort of held as gospel, to extend the metaphor. And so this article, it came in a process of deconstructing that libertarianism, and it's, I think, the third in a series that I've shared on Substack, and the evolution of just a lot of thinking and soul searching and reflecting over the last 6 months to a year.
One of the things that really struck out in the article to me was when you're talking about that moral equivalency, and I've noticed
Mhm.
whenever I was running for governor, and this goes back to way back to 2018. Anytime that I would it was very specific. Anytime that I would go after the Republicans, there were always people on the Libertarian side that you have to immediately criticize the Democrats at least as bad as you have the Republicans, because they're also, and it gets so ridiculous that there were times that, I remember one time the Republicans were trying to pass a ballot access bill against us, and the people in the party were blaming the Democrats for it just as much as they were the Republicans. Now, in some states like Illinois, obviously you would blame the Democrats more than you would the Republicans if they're the ones behind it. And if they're both doing it, that's fine. But it gets to this both sidism that we have to we're not going to call out the real bad actors here, because we want to do this both sides, that you have to vote for us, they're all the same. Well, they're not exactly the same. There maybe one side's worse than the other in one state, and another side worse than the other in another state. But it seemed to me to be intellectually lazy to do that argument, and it was also
Yes.
not being honest.
I think there's lots of layers to peel back on that onion, right? So the most surface layer is, I think there is a fair and legitimate critique of libertarianism in that a large number of adherents are going to have a right-leaning bias, that there's going to be more of a reaction when you attack Republicans to say you have to also attack Democrats, because there's like an almost obsessive insecurity about being perceived as something left of center. And so there has to be that constant demand for counterbalance. That's kind of a surface level thing, is to say there is this bias there, and that's fair to talk about it. Going a little bit deeper than that, I think you touch on a lot of the sort of reflexive and even tactical needs to embrace both sort of both sidesism, right? Especially capital L libertarians as a third party. The idea that there might be a clear moral choice between the two major parties is almost an existential threat in third party space. There's so much fixation on strategic voting and the idea that we have to convince everybody that it's not only is it not a wasted vote to vote for a third party, but that it is a wasted vote to vote for a Democrat or a Republican because they're just identical. There's no strategic voting consideration that you should ever make. And that I think comes from this deep seated tactical sense of going out and running races and knowing how hard it is to pry anybody away from voting Democrat or Republican to vote for any third party candidate. And so there's a sense that you can like never concede that there's any ounce of daylight between the other two options, or else you've just encouraged strategic voting to go off to the races. But then I think the deepest level, and this is what I really focused my piece around talking about, is I do think that philosophical libertarianism, stripped of any biases that might lean right, stripped of any tactical considerations that you might develop as a libertarian activist out in the field, bakes in a tendency towards that moral equivalence by flattening sort of all injustice, all action that's performed by the state. Anything the state does is violence. Anything the state does is aggression. And that sort of puts on the same ethical and moral playing field, the parking ticket that someone might slap on your windshield, and, ethnic cleansing that a totalitarian regime might carry out. And you're like, well, those are all NAP violations. That's all aggression. That's all violence. And that prevents libertarians from really answering the call of a strong, clear, moment where moral courage is needed in our politics, rising to those great injustices and acknowledging them as something wholly different and special than the litany of other sort of bureaucratic injustices libertarians tend to identify.
Well, and you would have been around during this time. I remember in 2020 when the COVID stuff was all happening, and there were libertarians that I heard make claims. Now, I'm not saying that the government should have been forcing people to wear masks or trying to act like they're going to force people to take injections or anything like that. Absolutely not. But there was this call that this was the worst tyranny in modern history, right? The worst thing the American government was done. And I thought, my stepdad was shot in Vietnam whenever,
Right.
and there were people were sent over and drafted and then forced into Canada. We had Japanese Americans serving in internment camps. We had black people that couldn't vote in the South. And as you go back much further than that, you had people being lynched in the streets. And that was all done on behalf of the governments. When I think about that, it seemed to me to be, one, intellectually lazy, but also allowed us not to really address the longstanding issues that we've had in this country.
Yeah.
It just glosses them over that, "Oh, this is the worst thing." Well, is it really the worst thing that's happened? Well, obviously not.
Well, I think libertarianism hands us a toolkit. And it doesn't just say these are tools you can use for certain things. It says these are the only tools you're ever going to need, right? It says this is a coherent, consistent, principled view of the world that's going to answer certainly all of your political questions and maybe many, many more questions beyond the political, but at the very least is going to provide an answer to anything you propose. I can feed it through this libertarian framework and have my answer to it. And I think what I've come to realize and reflect on is how ill-prepared that toolkit leaves libertarians for addressing those great moral challenges and for making that differentiation, like you said, for differentiating the moral questions this country had to confront during the civil rights era or during the Vietnam draft, and conflating that with, pandemic masking and things like that. Libertarianism doesn't provide the toolkit. Not only does it not provide the tools, but worse, I think the tools point us in direction of equating every injustice and saying it's all the same.
Well, it's also used as like a religion almost.
Mhm.
where we use it as, and I think I'm guilty of this too. I came around in 2004 and into the movement. I think I've been guilty as well. But where we've treated this as the only moral philosophy you need. Well, I think libertarianism is a very poor moral philosophy because it doesn't address things. I think you could say it's perfectly, should be legal, and I should have the right to go out and inject a bunch of heroin if I want to. That doesn't mean that's a good moral philosophy, not one that I'm going to do. And I think it's okay for people to have a religious philosophy, a spiritual philosophy, or just a personal moral philosophy that they have, um, that's outside of libertarianism.
Sure.
And and
I think it's almost required. Because libertarianism just doesn't answer those questions. Now, that doesn't mean that people are gonna find the right solutions or embrace things that align with where my values are, but I think it's something where you need those answers to come from somewhere because libertarianism does not prepare you for it. And it's not just the sort of like, should you inject heroin even if it's legal to inject heroin? It's the should I as an activist be fighting that fight in a time where there are all of these other fights demanding my attention, and how do I parse injustice against injustice by libertarian standards, because it's a grave injustice that I'm not allowed to go stand in the middle of the street right now and inject heroin into my eyeballs without being hauled away. But how do we, like, libertarianism doesn't provide the calibrating mechanism to say, how do I measure that catastrophe, that right is restricted against the fact that you have people being pulled out of their cars and homes in Minneapolis right now, that you have two Americans now that have been summarily executed in the streets by what is effectively a masked paramilitary force that the administration claims is accountable to no one and has absolute immunity to engage with the American public however they want. Well, libertarianism flattens those things, right? It says, well, that's all government violence. All government is always violence. And it might even make some libertarians say, I'm glad that we can now see the violence, right? At least this is out in the open. Boy, wasn't it worse when all that violence was hidden behind like smiles and proper procedure and bureaucracy and things like judicial warrants. Um, but I think no, right? Like that was not worse. That was unambiguously better when there was due process and checks to rein this in. And
you know,
I just think the toolkit's not there in pure libertarianism.
well, and I think that's right. And I would deviate on libertarianism. I would support using the military as just the Rwanda genocide to stop that. If we could use the military to go and jam the radio signals and stop the Rwandan genocide, should Bill Clinton have done that? Pure libertarianism would tell us no. I'm going to make a moral case that if I'm president, I'm going to do that.
Right.
Um, now, I'm not running for president, but if I were, that would be the case, and so I would deviate from that. I consider it as a deviation from it, but it certainly is allowed. And we have, particularly when it comes to you bring up the immigration issue, which I want to get to, but I I think it was last year the Bulwark and Reason magazine did a roundtable discussion. I don't know if you saw this, but it was I don't remember the exact title of it, but it was, based on around both sidism, right? If we just don't do anything.
Hmm.
But it really got me whenever, Tim Miller asked, Nick Gillespie, or he told him, he said, "Okay, so I could take you back to, you know, 2014 or whenever it was." And he said, "I could show you a picture of, Trump supporters hanging the Trump flag at the Capitol and, acting like this and trying to overthrow the election." And you would say, "Well, we would never support that." And he said, "But it would get worse." And I would tell you, and a few years later, you would say, "It doesn't matter. They're both the same sides." And that's kind of the equivalent of what a lot of people have done within the libertarian movement is they have said that, "Oh, these are the same sides." I hear people all the time that ended up supporting Donald Trump. Well, Kamala Harris was just as bad.
Right.
Really? Was Kamala Harris going to, send people to El Salvador to be raped in a prison, without any due process? I don't think so, particularly for people that had committed no crimes. You can, after the fact of the election, you can look back and say that no, Trump has done bad things. We don't need to do this. Kamala Harris was just as bad. Because I don't believe Kamala Harris would have done that. She had very bad policies. And one of the things that went back when I was thinking about the 2024 election, we had some libertarian candidates that I felt were less believed in less market liberalism than even Donald Trump, but certainly less than Joe Biden did or Kamala Harris did. They didn't support free trade. They have this idea that this Hoppian idea that has been allowed to come into the libertarian movement that we're going to have local communities create sundown towns, and they're going to it's basically communism. It's as far away from classical liberalism as you can get.
Yeah, but it's somehow pure because it's done by contract, right? And it respects consent. Like this is the argument. And if you only accept as axiomatic, premises, these sort of like very foundational tenets of libertarianism and don't allow anything else to come in, I understand how people get to these absurd and wild places. In my mind, when something leads you, you have this set of presumptions, and it leads you to some wild outcome and conclusion. That is a strong incentive to go back and challenge those initial axioms and those initial presumptions. You say, if flowing logically from here led me to there, there has to either be some fault in my logic or some fault in that starting position of basic assumptions. And I think libertarian philosophy has a few of those that have really, I've started to see as I've pulled back from it and created a little bit more space. Some of that is there's this very simplified and very noble sounding idea of consent culture that has gaps in it large enough to drive a truck through when it comes to how you apply principles to people incapable of consent, people like children, people with medical conditions. If I were to fall into a coma today, right, libertarian consent culture falls apart around me. A little bit less so because I've designated an agent to act in my behalf in the event of something like that. But children have never had that opportunity. Yeah, I think natural rights themselves start to fall apart when you circumscribe the entire universe. You say only negative rights are the only rights that we ever need to understand society and social interaction. Then you get to sort of some of these conclusions where it's like, well, gosh, if you freely entered into a contract that allows me to enslave you forever, then now what axiom does that violate? It kind of doesn't. If you're dying of thirst, if you've just come through the desert and you've gone days without water and you are literally dying of thirst and you arrive on my doorstep, you have no property right to a glass of water from me. You have no natural rights argument to demand it. I have no libertarian obligation to give you a drink, even though I have a tap that water just flows out of for very low cost. I think as a society, most of us recognize that there is some moral obligation, that there is some imperative that says, no, if you're literally dying on my doorstep and I can trivially save your life, the fundamental value of your life, the fundamental value of human dignity requires that I do something to render you what to me is trivial aid and to you is essential aid. There's nowhere in a libertarian framework to, I think, derive that out of these sort of core axiomatic principles. This comes from other non-libertarian places. And then, as we've been talking about that tendency towards moral equivalence and sort of leveling. And I will say, like, I'm not saying any of these things from a position of moral high ground. I have been an evangelist for a very stripped down philosophy of libertarianism for significant chunks, important chunks of my life, and in very loud and professional and impactful ways have been an advocate for exactly the libertarian view that I'm critiquing here. So I know some of your listeners, this may be hitting their ears as though I am challenging something that is very essential to them, but I am challenging something that is very essential to me and who I was and a big part of what I've lived. And so, there's certainly, if you're seeing yourself in something that I'm saying, know that I'm seeing myself in it too.
And, I consider myself to be a radical libertarian, probably more radical than most. But at the same time, I think that everyone, the pragmatic side. So the Mises Caucus took over the Libertarian Party, right? Because they were going to be pure and radical. And you saw how quickly that fell apart, right?
Oh,
it
yeah.
fell apart from the very beginning of it. It fell apart on issues such as immigration, issues where they weren't clearly defined, and it allowed them to justify it. Basically, it brought us into another thing that we have is we are very tribal, just like humans tend to be, and it has allowed us to, guess I want to say, form off into groups to where the other group is all bad and our group can do no wrong. That egocentrism that comes around there, that sociocentrism, I should say, that comes around there, that our group can do no wrong whatsoever, and we're gonna defend our group no matter what they do, no matter if they steal, no matter if they do horrible things, that we're going to defend them and we're going to defend their views. And it becomes cult like. And I didn't think libertarianism was capable of becoming cult like whenever I came into this, right? I didn't believe so. I saw a little bit of that with the Ron Paul movement. Not that I think that he was wanting to be a cult like figure, but he kind of was.
Right.
I remember in 2007, 2008, you criticized Ron Paul at all, and you would have libertarians, pragmatists, and we called themselves reformers back then, but reformers and the purists come after you for it because that was just not allowed.
Mhm.
And so I could start to see where that could come from. But we see it that there are certain people you're not allowed to criticize, particularly I think within the Mises caucus. There are certain people they were not allowed to criticize, and it led to like any dictatorship where eventually the person in power, the dictator, doesn't get any feedback telling them what they're doing is wrong, and it ultimately collapses around it, which is pretty predictable. But you could see that happen in libertarianism, and libertarianism doesn't do much to stop that.
There's an influential work and that's been out for a long time dealing with cults called "Combating Cult Mind Control" by Stephen Hassan. And in it, he puts forward, the bite model, which is, basically a systematized way of looking at how uh, cults engage in pressure tactics that modify, and control various aspects of our behavior and information and thoughts. And, I'm not going to do it justice here, but I sat down with it about 2 years ago, and this is not, by the way, how the bite model is applied, nor how anyone should apply it. But I went and took it like like a checklist, like a test, and said, how many of these do I think apply to the Libertarian Party that I just stepped away from? And going down the list, it was about half of these things that are like indicators of serious high demand, groups and cults. Uh, met the mark for how I viewed libertarianism. And then, as somebody who's had proximity but never membership with the sort of Mises movement that you've talked about coming into the party, I said, okay, thought experiment. Let's run the Mises movement through this standard. And all of a sudden, I'm not checking half the boxes. I'm checking like 75% of the boxes, right? And so what we've seen is a party that started from a place of already having some significant indicators of, and again, this is not a clinical way to apply this model. I cannot emphasize enough how not scientific what I just said was. But a party that's moving from a place where there already are tendencies and markers towards being a high demand political group. And then from 2022 onwards, certainly taking the party and party leadership and shifting that into hyperdrive where, whatever red flags were not being collected before start to be collected now.
Well, and it does have I mean, it happened rapidly, but it also happened gradually enough that I don't think people noticed that it was just one little thing after another that eventually led to it.
Right.
Where I don't know that they noticed it, but you make one decision, the chair hires her boyfriend, but because we don't criticize and we don't want to give the other side any credibility, that we're just gonna retroactively approve it. We're gonna kinda slap her wrist on the side, but, it ultimately led to a point where, she felt, entitled to embezzle, I think, because she didn't think they were gonna do anything to her, and that was that cult-like, thinking, because nobody would allow that to happen to their organization. Nobody would approve such stupidity, and nobody would, approve fundraising. I mean, when you were executive director, fundraising was over $2,000,000. It dropped
Yeah,
below $1,000,000 during all
I
of
know.
this.
I know. Even though I've unplugged from a lot of it, I still do get sent occasional pings when financials come out or something. And some of these months that are like sub $50,000 months, people will ask me, well, what would you do? And it's like, there is no, what would you do? I mean, what would I do? I'd resign if I ever had a month like that during my tenure. That's just such a point beyond abject failure by any standard that we were operating under even 5 years ago. That it's hard to believe that's where the party is. But like you said, it happens little by little and then all at once. And, there's tremendous value that I think, again, because libertarianism is not a framework that generally encompasses all of this, there's so much value in institutional stability and institutional strength. And what you're really seeing as those initial steps is all of those institutional safeguards going away. That cult-like mentality, it is a personality cult. It's a leader cult. And not unlike how Trump's movement is a leader cult. And that means that the marching order from leadership takes precedence over process and institution and organization, and those pesky little things about checking spending reports and having secondary sign-offs from people who are not related parties, having disclosures of conflicts of interest, having all of those things are these sort of stuffy, elitist, bureaucratic things that these sort of populist anti-institutional movements tend to reject culturally. And what comes along with that is a complete erosion of all of those safeguards. And I mean, I'll just be candid with you. You mentioned my time as executive director. I ended my time as executive director almost immediately with the 2022 board being elected and coming into office. I worked out a month and a half overlap time to transition and try to do the professionally ethical thing. But it was clear to me that I couldn't continue a professional career in an environment where those safeguards were not going to be in place, not just out of some sense of morality and ethics towards the people who that organization is supposed to serve, but also just from a self-serving place of the exposure that would have created for me. Like, what professional would work in a place where their signature is going to be on payments to related parties and things? Like, even if that wasn't going on at the time, it was just very clear that without institutional safeguards, that's where that would head. And I don't see how anybody could look at that and choose to be a part of it outside of that mindset you're talking about.
One of the things that really got me, it was fairly early on in their tenure. It was so after you resigned, there was some leaked Discord messages, I believe it was, from party staff, and they attacked. You were one of the people that were attacked in there. They were just insulting, part. And of course, I'm thinking this. One, you don't treat people like that, right? That's just a horrible way to treat anyone. And second, don't they realize there's potential legal implications for talking about staff? It was just it just
I
shocked
mean,
me.
I won't dig up anything painful for anybody else, but I'm happy to dig up what was referenced for me. And I believe a big thrust of the conversation about me was Angela speculating that I would imminently gender transition. And so anybody who was betting on that hopefully took the over. Pleased to report my gender remains the same.
It was stupid stuff. It was
But to
it was
your point,
laughable,
imagine
but you wouldn't do that to anyone.
and imagine in a corporate environment that took itself even halfway seriously, right?
Yeah.
Imagine your employer engaging in those sort of conversations about employees, and it very, very rapidly becomes really clear to anybody professional that that's just a very dangerous, liability-causing, irresponsible thing to do and engage in.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever been a manager at any place where I could have acted like that, and I wouldn't have been immediately suspended or fired, and then be fired later on after a suspension and an investigation took place. I just can't imagine it.
Yeah.
And Well, I think many of these people have probably learned their lesson. I hope they have. It was just ridiculous, and it was the idea of why would I continue to help an organization that treats people like this? And there was worse things they said about other people in there,
Far
and
worse.
it was just not a serious organization. And then that gets me also to like the New Hampshire stuff. So we're talking about libertarianism. The moral cowardice here I also see is to call out, blatant bigotry. There is not the backbone to call it out because they have a right to be bigots, you know? You have a right to be a bigoted and sexist ass. I will defend your right to do it. I have defended the rights to, people to fly the Confederate flag around. I've defended the rights of you have the right to do that. I don't have to associate with you. I don't have to be a part of an organization that associates with you. I can defend your right to do whatever you want so long as you're not harming others, but I don't have to associate with it. And when the party does, well, we've got the right to do this. We've got the right. You're violating my free speech. No, and no, David Nolan would have not put up with this. The party founders would have not put up with this, and they didn't build an organization to discriminate against people like that. This was some horrible, horrible things that they've said about people, and the party leadership has no backbone and had no backbone to do anything about it. Some of them do now, but they just allowed them to run amok over there and, sabotage the, entire libertarian movement and the word libertarian too.
Yeah, well, and I think some of it comes back. Yeah, sure. Like feckless leadership goes a long way to explain it, and that's we can blame people, right? I'm a little less interested in people these days, though I understand many people who are still engaged are, just because I'm now in a position of it not being my circus, not being my monkeys, right? But I think that what you're describing gets to one of those really important things I've been grappling with about the libertarianism I espoused for so long, because I always talked about a stripped down, natural rights only, negative rights are the only rights version of libertarianism. And in that sense, you go back to this sort of Lockean idea of a state of nature, right? What rights would you possess if you were alone on an island with nobody around you? Well, do you have the right to free healthcare? Of course you don't, because healthcare doesn't fall out of the sky. Do you have a right to say whatever you want? Well, of course you do, because there's no one there to stop you. What if that's horrific and bigoted? There's no one there to stop you, right? Like the negative rights, you can believe what you want, you can say what you want, you can feel what you want. Alone on an island, you could see a tree and you could chop it down and you could build a hut out of it, so you can mix your labor with things and create property. And we're off to this very, foundational natural rights argument sort of races. And I just think that it leads to very absurd places. And I think the reason it leads to such absurd places like you clarified, like, well, gosh, we can't do anything about just wild open racism in society because it's your right to be a racist. So I guess we better just go, aw, shucks, and let you keep running that LPNH Twitter account. I think that what it's missing is the idea that humans in a state of nature don't exist on an island separate from each other. In a state of nature, we do exist in communities. And those communities, in varied and different ways, do create some system of positive rights that are based off of expectation and obligation that we are seen within that context to have to each other. And that's not this like morally absolute thing that you can point back to, because communities can come to the wrong conclusions, and cultures can be toxic and bad and create positive rights that we don't think have value when we filter them through a moral lens that's informed by human dignity and sort of enlightenment principles. But it also, you can imagine a society where there's a moral obligation to, for example, care for somebody when they're injured. And that if you don't do that, the rest of that society is going to think badly of you and is going to shun you, and it will jeopardize your place in that natural human, that human society in a state of nature as a community. And you could imagine similarly that if the role that you play in that community is to constantly bomb throw and denigrate and demean other members of that natural community, well, hell, the tribe's not going to put up with that for very long. You're gonna learn about your negative right to do that, with their right to decide you're not a part of their society. And so, yes, there are all these natural rights arguments that they have every right to be racist. They have every right to be anti-trans. They have every right to be anti-Semitic. They have every right to be horrible bigots in a negative rights, natural rights sense. That is true. They have no right, negative right or positive right, to be those things in society with me. They have no claim to me recognizing them as a member of any culture that I acknowledge value in, and any, whether it's a polity or a party, or just the my concept of being united with people in some sense of brotherhood. They have no claim to any of that from me based on any kind of rights-based argument that they can put forward. And I think, you know, uh, I don't know that a libertarian party can operate on that standard, because I think, your people, of course, who are listening to this are fine and handsome and talented people. But I think if this were going to an audience of what in my time were 20,000 Libertarian Party members, I think more of them would have a tremendously huge problem with what I just laid out than would applaud and accept it. I just think we're trained in libertarianism to see negative rights as the only philosophy that circumscribes rights, and as you sort of like the only rights that are valid. And anything that engages with society or community doesn't really have a role or a place in that.
And I have, thought so much about how, I've watched people that supported me in my run for governor, and that I see them just posting some of the most horrible things. I mean, defending, shooting a guy 9 times in the back in Minnesota. And I never stood for any of those things. How did how did they get to that point where they could say that's justified? And it comes back to this, well, they're communist, they're leftist, and if you support them, you're a communist and leftist too. And it
Yeah, I mean,
becomes tribal where we come back to the right, where we've always had this fixation with the right. And, well, I shouldn't say, we, but, libertarianism in general, I think, has had an unhealthy fixation with the right.
Yeah, and I think that you're identifying that not only, I'm kind of making the claim that there are ways in which this is a bad philosophy. You're countering that not only is that perhaps so, but that they're also bad at it. Because even by the standards of the strictest, most dogmatic libertarianism, the rallying around ICE is justifiable only by the sort of basest, bigoted arguments that there are whole races of people incapable of comprehending liberty or exercising it on their own. And that should be a philosophy that's just repugnant to anybody who even remotely embraces the liberal values that for 250 years have sat at the heart of this American experience and experiment. There's just, it's so antithetical to every tradition that derives out of those values to say um, that somehow liberty is confined only to be exercised by some, small benighted group of people.
Well, and there's a thing with human nature too, that we can be very principled, and sometimes the most principled people will find the most principled reasons to support some of the most horrific things out there. And, I think that's part of it, like, "Oh, the ends justifies the means, that we're gonna have to do it." And it goes back to, some of these people that I have respected and known for years, they have a financial incentive to act the way they do because they're on radio shows, they get kickbacks from whatever, or they would lose employment. There's financial and personal incentives to keep these views to hold these views, no matter the damage. And I mean, we look back and, I'm not comparing today in America to Nazi Germany, but you look back and you can see how that certainly happened, right? And at the end of it all, no one will ever have known anything was going on, right? Well, they didn't know it was gonna lead to that. But it does start at that first time that you support, federal agents murdering people in the street, and you've got conservatives doing the same thing. I view, the Libertarian Party as more of a micro of the larger country. You see conservatives doing that. I mean, you've got, judges appointed by Trump out there, saying you don't have a Second Amendment right in DC anymore, something that would have been appalling just a few years ago had they said, and now you hear people on the right have no real objection to it. Some do, but not a whole lot. And it's the same way with even with libertarianism, as there's things that are being said today in the name of libertarianism by the podcast groups, by the Hoppians, that a few years ago would have been just flatly rejected. But ultimately, it's led them to go towards a fascist way where they can support anything they want. And the only pushback there will be is we don't like the way they're deporting people. We don't like the way they are. Oh, so you want to market it a little bit nicer, and that's where a lot of it comes down to. They don't
Yeah.
they don't view the heavy hand of the state the way that, libertarians should view that. Um, Now you mentioned something I think was real, and I wanted to touch upon the 250 years of America. And one of the things that, America has been great. We've had problems, but we have been great because we had open migration among the states. We had also open trade among the states, and when we didn't have open trade among the states before the Constitution, it didn't work very well. That the fact that we have had open trade and open migration among the states has allowed us to prosper.
Yeah, I mean, it's any one of these people that you don't hear it as much anymore. It was more of a campaign slogan than I think it's moved on to harsher and more abundant things. But you used to hear people say a lot on the right that if you don't have borders, you don't have a country. And every one of those people are living in a U.S. state that, by their definition, doesn't have borders, and that there's no border enforcement. There's nobody impeding free movement across those lines. Nobody stops you from moving from Texas to Oklahoma. Nobody stops you from crossing. Nobody stops you from visiting. Nobody requires you jump through any hoops to become a citizen of one versus the other. Like, at some point, if you're in a state for long enough, they really want you to change your driver's license. Like, that's about as bureaucratic and heavy-handed as it gets. There's no citizenship test. There's no citizenship requirement. You are free to not just move, but to relocate, to live, to work, to make your life however you want to make it freely across those imaginary lines that separate our 50 state governments from each other. And nobody says that, Arkansas doesn't exist just because it doesn't have border controls. Of course it does. There's a jurisdiction within which its laws apply, and the laws of Oklahoma don't. And so I think, you can certainly view countries in the same way. There's a lot of libertarians that engage in a lot of motivated reasoning. And this is not a libertarian problem, by the way, uniquely. I think I've been in politics a long time. I was in Republican politics longer than I was in libertarian politics. I'm out of both of them now and in some kind of weird liminal oppositional space to what the administration is doing that is coming into existence and defining itself. But I think that uh, 20 years now in and around political operators and communicators and campaigns has given me an appreciation for exactly how human it is to gamify the way we talk about our politics. And it's not just the tribalism that you point out, but once you have that tribalism identified, it's a fun little puzzle to solve how to take your value set and map that on an argument for the thing you want to argue for anyway. So to say, how do I take these libertarian core principles and find a way to make the restrictionist argument on immigration? How do I do that and find a way to say ICE is great, actually? It's the one government agency that should exist. How do I do that becomes an intellectual exercise in, are you clever enough to unpack it and communicate it, and not an ethical exercise in whether that makes sense with any value-oriented framework that you're adopting, or whether those values and axioms deserve to be challenged in their own right. People don't operate at that level. In politics, you just tend to gamify making the point that you need to make.
Well, and I do see this where people argue these ridiculous hypotheticals with you, and instead of saying, "Hey, or we have federal agents out there that are invading a city that the state doesn't want them at," and also, I'm old enough to remember just a few years ago when you were all about states' rights. Um, and you were making those arguments. But now oh, well, the ends justifies the means here, and you're going to debate hypotheticals instead of discussing, hey, we have ICE agents here that are shooting somebody 9 times in the back and shooting someone after they've, or driving off, and that we're going to justify that. We're going to justify that sort of behavior, but we're not actually going to justify it. We're just not going to talk about it. We're going to go to these extreme hypotheticals to continue to debate larger border policy when we've got a crisis right here. I'm going to ask you a question. Pretty blunt. Is Trump an existential threat to the country?
Yeah, absolutely.
And
Unambiguous.
this is where we agree on this. And when I hear many libertarians talk, and you know, and even modern progressives too, they don't tend to define this as an existential threat. We have, as far as I can see, the institutions breaking down,
Mhm.
which some libertarians would like the institutions to break down, particularly anarchists, and I can understand that point of view. But you don't want it to be replaced with Viktor Orban in Hungary. And that's what we're getting. You could look at what's happened in Hungary. It's the same exact playbook that's happening here. Yeah, we may have some level of free speech, but you're gonna have to speak on things like this, a Substack, because you're not gonna get access to any media that's gonna be out there playing. You may be targeted, if you will. If you own a nonprofit, if you're a part of a nonprofit, you're gonna be targeted because you're Soros funded. The same arguments they used, in Hungary and they've been using for the past, decade and a half or whatever, are being used here. It's no surprise that Viktor Orban that Trump is a big fan of Viktor Orban and all the time, talks about Viktor Orban. It seems like the same exact playbook that they're trying here, maybe with a little bit more violence.
Yeah, well, and we can unpack how Orban conceives of his own regime, right? Like, Orban has tended to refer to Hungary as an illiberal democracy. It is not about eroding the actual act of going to a ballot box and shoving a ballot in it. It's about eroding and eliminating all of those other liberal values and protections that make American democracy what it is and give us our character, the fundamental recognition of human dignity, the freedom of speech, the freedom to practice worship as you see fit, the right to assemble, the right to voice opposition to the government, the right to you want, I mean, talk about go down the Bill of Rights. Third Amendment's making a comeback. The right to not have troops walk into your house and say this is ours now. The right to due process if you're being accused of a crime. The right to not just be drug away from your business or your home or your car and flown to the other side of the country with no charges, with no warrants, with nothing. And then even if you prove your innocence, which is bass backwards in a country where the standard is supposed to be the presumption of innocence, but that even when you prove your obvious innocence by providing citizenship documents, for example, you're simply cut loose in whatever t-shirt they drug you out of your living room in sub-zero temperature halfway across the country with no way to get home. And this is the sense of justice and injustice in that is wild. And I think you're right that there are a lot of libertarians who say no, institutions are bad, right? Because institutions are government, and government is bad because government is violence, because government isn't consensual, because government is built on force, and therefore due process is just some bureaucratic step in this force wielding machine of our own oppression. And once you go down that rabbit hole, there's just no moral compass left for you to stand in the way of all the human progress we've made over the last 10,000 years as a civilized species, and say, no, there are points that we do not want to roll the odometer back to. Even if we're trying to get forward to some destination that we think is more free or that is better, there are conditions that are less free, that are worse, and that there are lots of institutions that we have in a liberal democracy in place to keep us locked in to the progress that we've been able to make, such as it is. And I think Trump is not only an existential threat to all of that. I think Trump has that extinction level event for some elements of our society and our position in the world has now already occurred. The rules-based international order with America centrally positioned in a role of moral leadership and all of the advantages that accrues, that's gone. That's not coming back. That's not coming back in a post-Trump world. That's just done. The best we could hope for is to be a player at the table with other liberal democracies in a collaborative partnership that has some elements of that liberal post-war order that we were able to lead for so long. But that's just gone. Domestically, I'm a little bit more optimistic, and I think that there is still time and hope to stand up and save things like rule of law, save things like accountability, to sort of restore the checks and balances that are missing, to have a Congress again. I think there are still those are still things that keep me getting up in the morning and fighting. But I think it's very easy to imagine us not winning that fight and those things going away the same way our leadership in the world has.
Yeah, it's certainly a frightening thing, and, and I saw it, in early on in this, second term, with and now it seems so far away, and it seems like a minor thing, but whenever they were, threatening the attorneys, right, that you'll lose all the abi
Mhm.
well, that was a way to stop anyone from questioning the administration. You're gonna go after all the attorneys, you're gonna go after the TV host, but you're making an example to everyone not to speak out, and people little people, if you will, that are just out there speaking their mind at your grocery store or wherever, feel a little bit of pressure not to do that anymore.
Yeah.
You're feeling just a little bit of pressure not to do that anymore. And as long as we have free speech, I mean, Americans, love to give their opinions. There's probably a limit to what can be done here.
Mhm.
But the second that that goes away, I could see horrible, horrible things happening. And the other part too is Americans view things in such different lenses. We could watch a video, and someone else could watch the same video, and depending on where their point of view is, they may come up with an entire different story and see a whole different video than what we see.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Well, people react to these things the way they're told to react, right? But I don't want to get too far down into doom and gloom because there is an optimistic side to this.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that. I wanted to ask you about the work you're doing the work you're doing. If you wanted to tell us
Oh,
about
sure.
that, because that's a little bit more positive right there.
Yeah, well, absolutely. So, you mentioned at the top that I was the executive director now of the newly launched Project Liberal Foundation, which is a sister organization to the same Project Liberal that you may have seen on social media and with all the reach out there, some amazing
Amazing
accounts that
reach,
do
amazing reach.
tremendous engagement, hit a huge audience, way outside the bubble that we're used to talking about as a libertarian bubble. Massive, online presence that grabs center right, center left, all across people who are usually a little bit too online, usually a little bit too engaged politically, but other than that, a very broad cross section. And the foundation has spun up around the launching of a project that we're calling the On Ramp to Liberalism. And what it's modeled on is basically the idea that, when I was a young activist, I worked my first campaign when I was 16 years old. And when you're a young activist in the GOP, there's this very wide, very welcoming pipeline to activate you. I went straight off a campaign to being a college Republican on campus when I went to college, and within a year, was attending, getting scholarships to attend CPAC and VIP behind the scenes meetings to go meet conservative authors and Supreme Court justices and such celebrities as exist in that world. And uh, it's all with this sort of whirlwind whisking you into a lifetime of activism and involvement and engagement. It is truly a funnel, right? And it was largely harmless, right? It funneled me into a conservative politics were a pretty milquetoast conservative politics of the early 2000s. Now a lot of the funnels are a lot more online than when I was engaging with that, absent the era of social media, and B, lead to a lot more scary, toxic, dark and dangerous places, right? It funnels that kids will fall down online and end up, in Groyper land with Nick Fuentes, or, radicalized into the alt-right. And like, it's far too easy to find those rabbit holes. And so what we're doing is converting that big engagement, that big reach of Project Liberal into a funnel of our own that will lead people who find us into the broader liberalism movement. There's this big liberal movement that's been gaining steam the past 2 or 3 years, that's centered around what you would probably, Jake, call classical liberalism, right? But this idea that these core values of the Enlightenment that our country's founded on, this core recognition of human dignity, is fundamental and foundational, and that you can embrace ideals that recognize and center the individual and respect that value, but also approach things intelligently, approach things thoughtfully, engage in introspective discourse, embody values of curiosity and industry that have sort of used to typify the way we thought about American politics before the dogmatism that currently exists on the far right, on the broad right these days, the MAGA right, but also on the far left. And uh, and so we're opening up this big pipeline. It's going to involve pushing a lot more educational content out on the foundation side, bringing together testimonials to start to build a sense of community, growing out community spaces where liberals from across that spectrum, from across our audience, can interact and engage with each other, and then also building partnerships out to other liberal organizations in that space who host conferences, who host events, saying, let's help get some of these young liberals starting out in politics. Let's help get them some scholarships so that they can attend some conferences, they can be in some heady spaces, they can have some of the big conversations that people are having, they can meet a few of their heroes. And then also let's connect them up with internship opportunities, entry-level job opportunities, volunteer chances in this growing network of liberal orgs. So that's what Project Liberal Foundation is doing. That's our on-ramp to liberalism. It's exactly what it says on the tin. We're trying to build a big, wide on-ramp for folks who find us online, engage with our content, think our memes are super dank, and don't know where to go from there, and that we can help onboard people into the broader liberal movement.
I wanted to just give a brief comment before we wrap up on that, and why I like that. So often I think that one, we've got great think tanks in the realm of classical liberalism, libertarianism. Future Freedom Foundation, Cato Institute. You've got them that do a lot of work and put out a lot of information, and that's great. But they don't bring people together. And instead, as libertarians, we, in the past, or classical liberals, or whatever, have tried to use political parties for this method, and it becomes tribal. It doesn't really work, and it doesn't. It's lacking something. And I like the idea of taking it out of the political party's hands, because they're not really set up to do this sort of thing anyway. It's not an activism club. It's not a social club. And to take that out of the hands of the parties and build something that can last outside of that scope,
Mhm.
and educate people and make sure that people are really understanding and doing things productively. And hitting it
Yeah,
from a
and
different perspective than what anyone else is doing. And I do like the fact that you've taken back that the word liberal as well.
yeah. Oh, I just call myself a liberal. I know you like to call yourself a classical liberal. I just call myself a liberal. I feel people who know me know I'm classic AF anyways. But 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 I also appreciate the
Mega's gonna
umbrella.
think you're a communist no matter what, so it doesn't really
Yeah.
matter.
Well, that's true too. The we're in a moment right now where I think the real dividing line politically in this country is against this sort of illiberal Orbanist rejection of these core liberal values. And so I am I've always in my politics been a little bit more market oriented. I'm always going to come from like an economic free market place in my own personal presentation on things. But to the extent that we're building a broad coalition, I want anyone who's embracing those core liberal values on my side. I want everyone, like I want fraternity with the entire spectrum of liberal thought, precisely meaning embracing those liberal values. And so if you are if you're somebody who is a classical liberal in a very strict Hayekian sense, great. But like there are lots of people who center fundamental human dignity and also think Keynesian economics has something to say. And I'm not gonna, I think libertarians would push those people by the face out of the room, and I think to the extent classical liberal orgs would tend to stiff arm those people. And we can't be doing that right now. There is an existential thing that's happening in the United States where those of us who recognize core human dignity as a value and those who do not are a dividing line. And we need to be together in that. And so that's why I'm happy to call myself a liberal. And anyone who wants to scratch deeper beneath the surface, I'm always happy to engage in a thoughtful, intellectual conversation because that's what liberals do.
Well, and there's, you mentioned the Keynesians, but one of the things about most modern presidents, and actually most presidents of the
Yeah.
United States, is they always valued some form of liberal trait. They always valued the things that did make us great. They did value. It's a modern, well, it's always existed, right? The idea of tariffing, the idea of trade wars, the idea of that we're just going to be isolationist. Uh, this isolationist movement, as the America First movement, it had its had its role into trying to defend the Nazis back in the 20s and 30s, but it's always been there. Whether it be Pat Buchanan in the late 80s, early 90s, always been there, but it's never really had any prominence until Donald Trump. George W. Bush certainly didn't reject free trade. Now, they may not go as far as we want to, but it is a common ground that I think that we can build some coalitions when it comes to this sort of illiberalism that we can at least fight against. These are people that still agree with us on many of those basic core fundamentals, and others that just don't. That there are others that are happy with the illiberalism that is occurring.
Yeah, and honestly what I see is I don't see any real harsh dividing lines within a coalition around trade illiberalism or anything like that. I think those broad liberal values are now becoming part and parcel with what it means to oppose the illiberalism that this administration is imposing on the American people. I think it's much more starkly motivated and defined by what we talked about earlier on immigration, seeing people, literally summarily executed in the streets is a very different thing than, abstract trade conversations, but it bundles in with the same set of liberal values. And when you start to coalesce around that, all of that other stuff falls into place.
And I think these are issues that the American people largely already agree with us on because that's the way we've lived for so long, and they're starting to see the dangers of
Yeah.
of of the illiberalism. Uh, we are
I,
coming
I
up on.
think I think to just to maybe clarify the scope of that, like I think libertarians would tend to look back at the political history of the United States and say, like outside of the LP, there were never any libertarian parties, right? Like for the first time ever, we've brought all these principles together, and none of the other parties are ever that. I think over the vast majority of America's history, both major parties were liberal political parties in that they fundamentally aligned with those core liberal values and then argued about implementation, priority, different factions within liberal thought finding themselves manifest through that and coalesced a lot around different special interest considerations, right? And that's tended to define our party systems. I think as we move out of the party system that has defined the last 50 years and into a new party system, where the Republicans and Democrats are both really shaking up their coalitions and reforming. You're seeing a MAGA Republican Party that is very illiberal in a way that is fundamentally out of alignment with most of America's history and most of the partisanship, no matter what the label was, that has happened throughout that history. So I think it's maybe more important than ever that now, in that context, you start to see liberals aligning broadly on those values rather than fighting with each other over flavors of those values. And I see that happening.
And you mentioned one thing I wanna touch on before we leave and kinda get your thoughts on, you mentioned that, many libertarians would say that we have, never had a libertarian party before, and there's also others that will argue this mythical time that never really existed that was magically libertarian in the 1800s or something, and of course, it wasn't libertarian. I think I would argue that the liberal foundation that we were set up with in this country allowed us to address a lot of the issues later on. And we weren't discussing, gay rights or women's rights, and even civil rights is being discussed. But I think it'll eased us into those conversations as a nation, and helped us become a better nation in many things. I question this idea that things were always great, that you hear some libertarians try to say, because they weren't. Yeah, they may have been okay if you were a straight white Christian male and a property owner, but they weren't great for everyone. But I would say that we became more enlightened on some things over the years, and that we've been able to expand those rights and freedoms, those basic rights and freedoms.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be very weary of anybody who's making the case that America was at some point in the past the freest it's ever been, and it's been downhill since then. If your concept is that the freest America's ever been is in 1855, that should be a huge red flag. If it's that it was the freest it's ever been in 1890, that should be a huge red flag. If you think it was the freest it's ever been in 1919, that should be a huge red flag. And I think what should be a red flag in the general case is this idea of creating an idealized past and a desire to return to some idealized state of being that never has actually existed, but that we can create in the national consciousness. This is not a hallmark of liberal politics generally. This is a hallmark of reactionary politics generally, and reactionary movements, right? It's authoritarian mass movements that point back to an imagined past, particularly right-wing authoritarian movements that point back to an imagined hypothetical past full of glory, full of national
And then
unity,
someone had to take it away from you,
and then someone's taken it from you.
whether
And
it
if
be
we
the
think that,
Jews, whether it be the Chinese, whether it be someone else, whether it be the
yeah.
left-wing lunatics, someone has taken it away from you.
And whenever you hear somebody politically starting to craft a segment of that argument, I don't think we should mistake it for somebody who's operating within the liberal tradition. And that includes libertarians. When you hear libertarians start to construct that argument for an idealized path, or idealized past, that libertarianism, whatever they're calling libertarianism, is something that is out of step and out of line with that liberal tradition that this country is founded on and the values that we've talked about. And I think that should be a huge red flag that what you're actually dealing with is right-wing reactionary politics.
Absolutely. We are over an hour now. I wish I could, continue on for hours and hours. This is a great conversation. Thanks so much for coming on. That was a very enlightening conversation for me. I appreciate everything that you're doing, and I will definitely follow more of what the Project Liberal is doing.
Thank you. I've loved our conversation. I really appreciate you asking me to come have it.
We'll have to have you on soon. Thanks again.